It was one of those quiet afternoons when the sun hung lazily above the small courthouse, and the air inside felt heavy with boredom. A few people sat scattered across the wooden benches, whispering softly, while waiting for their cases to be called. The ceiling fan turned slowly, doing little to move the still air. Everyone was waiting for the same thing, to get through the day and go home. Then the door at the back opened and a man walked in. He wasn't loud and he didn't seem to want any attention. He was tall, calm, and neatly dressed in a dark suit. His shoes shone as if freshly polished, and he carried a small leather briefcase. He looked like someone who belonged in an office, not a courtroom filled with nervous faces and impatient lawyers. He quietly took a seat near the front, his posture straight and his expression composed. A few people turned to look at him, curious. They hadn't seen him before, and in small towns like this, new faces always drew attention. At the judge's bench sat the presiding judge, a man known by many for his pride and short temper. He believed his authority made him untouchable, and over the years his confidence had grown into arrogance. People respected him, but mostly out of fear. When his eyes fell on the man sitting near the front, he frowned slightly. Something about the man's calmness annoyed him. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, too self-assured for someone the judge didn't recognize. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen impatiently, then said loudly, "Sir, are you supposed to be sitting there?" The man looked up politely. "Yes, Your Honor," he said in a calm, even voice. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you here for one of the hearings?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Because if you're waiting for your case, defendants usually sit in the back." There was a brief pause. A few people looked from the judge to the man, wondering how he would respond. The man simply said, "I'm not here as a defendant, sir. I'm here for official business." The judge smirked, clearly not convinced. "Official business? With who?" The man smiled slightly but didn't answer. "I'd prefer to wait until it's the right time to speak." That only made the judge angrier. He didn't like being told to wait, especially not by someone who looked like an outsider. "Listen," the judge said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This courtroom runs on order. You don't just walk in here and sit wherever you please. If you're not part of today's schedule, you wait outside. Understood?" The man didn't argue. He simply stood, nodded respectfully, and walked toward the door. His calmness was almost unsettling. Before leaving, he quietly said, "Understood, Your Honor. I'll wait outside." The door closed behind him, and for a moment the room was silent. Then the judge turned to the clerk and muttered something under his breath about people not knowing their place. A few in the courtroom chuckled softly, afraid to show what they really thought, but not everyone was amused. One of the younger lawyers in the room frowned, uncomfortable with what he'd just seen. He glanced at the door where the man had exited and then looked back at the judge, wondering if he'd gone too far. The session continued, but the tension hung in the air. Every time someone spoke, the judge's irritation seemed to grow. He made sharp comments, cut off defendants, and snapped at his staff. It was as if the brief encounter earlier had spoiled his entire mood. About half an hour later, the door opened again. The same man stepped inside quietly, carrying his briefcase as before. The judge's eyes narrowed immediately. "I thought I told you to wait outside," the judge said coldly. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied evenly, "but the clerk asked me to come in." Before the judge could respond, the clerk hurried forward, looking nervous. "Your Honor, this gentleman—" "I don't need explanations," the judge interrupted sharply. "If he's not on today's list, he has no business in my courtroom." The clerk hesitated, glancing at the man, unsure of what to do. The man simply nodded to the clerk as if to say it was fine, then turned back to the judge. "I assure you, Your Honor," he said, "I'm not here to cause any trouble. I'm only here to observe." "Observe?" the judge repeated, almost laughing. "Who exactly gave you permission to observe my courtroom?" The man's eyes met his calmly. "That's something I'll explain at the right time." The judge leaned forward. "No, you'll explain it now. Who are you?" Before the man could answer, a few people at the back whispered quietly. The clerk looked pale, like he wanted to stop the conversation but couldn't. "I'm waiting," the judge said, his voice growing harder. The man didn't look angry. If anything, he looked patient. Too patient, which only made the judge more irritated. "Very well," the man said softly. "I'll wait until the proper officer arrives. I'm sure he can clarify my role." At that moment, someone in the courtroom laughed quietly, thinking the man was bluffing. The judge's lips curled in a smirk. "You must think this is a joke," he said. "Let me be clear. You don't walk into my court and make demands. You either tell me who you are or you leave immediately." The man took a breath, glanced around the courtroom and said, "I'm not making demands. Your Honor, I'm simply following procedure." The judge slammed his hand on the table. "Procedure? Don't talk to me about procedure. I've been running this courtroom for 20 years. The man didn't react. He stood quietly, hands folded in front of him. "Bailiff," the judge said, motioning toward the officer near the wall. "Escort this man out until he learns to show some respect." The bailiff looked hesitant but stepped forward. Before he could reach the man, the courtroom door opened again. Everyone turned. A court officer entered, out of breath, holding a folder. "Apologies for being late," he said. Traffic was terrible. He looked around, spotted the man near the front, and his eyes widened. Immediately, he straightened his posture and said respectfully, "Sir, I'm so sorry for the delay. We've been expecting you." The judge froze. The room went silent. The officer hurried over, shaking the man's hand with both of his. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person, sir." The judge blinked, confused. "Wait," he said slowly. "You know this man?" The officer turned to him, still holding the man's folder. "Of course. This is Judge Thompson, the senior circuit court inspector. He's here on behalf of the state judiciary to review courtroom conduct and performance." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every face in the courtroom turned toward the man, who had been quietly insulted minutes earlier. Even the bailiff stepped back, looking mortified. The judge's face went pale, his mouth slightly open but no words coming out. Judge Thompson gave a small nod and said, "That's correct, Your Honor. I came unannounced to see how things are managed here." He spoke softly, but the words carried power. The courtroom was so quiet that even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. The presiding judge's hand trembled slightly as he tried to regain composure. I wasn't aware," he stammered. "If I had known," Judge Thompson raised a hand gently. "That's exactly the point, sir. You weren't supposed to know." The room stayed frozen in that moment. Every eye locked on the man who had walked in humbly and been treated with disrespect. The presiding judge sank slightly in his chair. Realizing what he had done, he had humiliated a senior official in front of his own courtroom. Worse, he had exposed exactly the kind of behavior Judge Thompson had come to observe. But Judge Thompson didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or look angry. He simply adjusted his briefcase and said calmly, "Shall we begin the observation now?" The officer nodded quickly, handing over documents. The other judge muttered something about misunderstanding, but his words stumbled over themselves. As proceedings continued, no one dared to speak above a whisper. Even the once arrogant judge sat quietly, his tone softened, his pride broken. People in the courtroom couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. Just an hour ago, that man had been treated like a nobody, and now he stood revealed as one of the most respected figures in the state judiciary. Judge Thompson, meanwhile, continued his work without a hint of smugness. He reviewed files, took notes, and listened carefully. But everyone in that room could feel it. The shift in power, the silent reminder that dignity and respect should never depend on appearances. As the day went on, the story spread through the courthouse halls. Whispered voices carried the news from room to room. Some smiled quietly, feeling a sense of justice. Others looked ashamed. By the time court adjourned that afternoon, the presiding judge couldn't meet anyone's eyes. He watched as Judge Thompson walked out calmly, the same way he had entered, quiet, respectful, and composed. And though he said nothing more that day, his presence had already spoken louder than any ruling ever could. It was clear to everyone who had been there. The courtroom might never be the same again. The next morning, the courthouse was filled with whispers. People spoke in low voices, careful not to let the wrong ears hear. Everyone had heard what happened the day before, the unexpected visit from the senior judge, and how the presiding judge had embarrassed himself in front of everyone. By the time the doors opened for the day's hearing, most of the courthouse staff already knew the story. Some tried to act normal, pretending it was just another day, but the tension was impossible to hide. Even the clerks moved a little more carefully, their voices quieter, their expressions more serious. Inside the judge's chamber, the presiding judge sat at his desk with his head in his hands. The file in front of him lay open, but he hadn't read a single word. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment when he realized who the man he had insulted really was. That memory had played in his head all night, over and over again, each time heavier than before. He had been proud of his position for years. People respected him. Lawyers tried to please him. Defendants feared him. But all it took was one mistake, one moment of arrogance for everything to come crashing down. When the clerk knocked softly on his door, he straightened quickly, trying to look composed. "Yes," he said, his voice tight. "Sir," the clerk said, stepping in carefully. "Judge Thompson is in the main courtroom. He's asked that you join him." The judge's throat went dry. He had been dreading this moment. Still, he nodded. "I'll be there in a minute." He took a deep breath, adjusted his robe, and walked toward the courtroom. Every step felt heavier than the last. As he entered, the room grew silent. Judge Thompson stood near the front, speaking quietly with a few court officers. His tone was calm, his manner patient. When he saw the presiding judge, he gave a polite nod. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," the other replied, his voice uneasy. Judge Thompson motioned for him to come closer. "I hope you don't mind me continuing the observation today. I'd like to understand how things are usually run here." "Of course," the local judge said quickly. "You're welcome to observe whatever you wish." Judge Thompson smiled faintly. "Thank you. But I'm not here to make anyone uncomfortable. My purpose is to see how justice feels in this room, for everyone who steps inside it." The words hit harder than they sounded. How justice feel? Not how it looks or sounds, but how it feels. The courtroom fell into a thoughtful silence. The hearings began soon after. A woman came forward for a minor property dispute. Then an older man faced a traffic violation. Normally, the local judge would handle such cases briskly, cutting people off and rushing through the details. But today his tone was different, softer, more careful, almost humble. Judge Thompson sat quietly, taking notes, observing every word and gesture. He noticed how nervous the staff seemed, how unsure everyone looked around him. But he also saw something else, a flicker of awareness. People were starting to realize that fairness wasn't about rank or tone. It was about humanity. During a short break, Judge Thompson stepped outside the courtroom. The hallway buzzed with whispers that stopped the moment he appeared. He walked slowly, looking at the old photos on the walls, former judges, clerks, and officers who had served in that courthouse decades before. One of the young clerks approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he said softly, "if you don't mind me saying, I was there yesterday. When the judge, He hesitated, unsure how to finish. Judge Thompson turned to him kindly. "When he asked me to leave?" The young man nodded awkwardly. "Yes, sir. I just wanted to say I'm sorry you were treated like that." Thompson gave a small smile. "Thank you, son. But don't worry. It's not about me." The clerk looked confused. "It's not?" "No," Thompson said. "It's about the kind of culture we allow in a place meant for justice. When respect disappears, truth follows soon after. My goal isn't to embarrass anyone. It's to remind everyone what this place stands for." The clerk nodded slowly, taking in the words. Something about the man's calmness was deeply grounding. When court resumed after the break, the next case involved a young worker who had been accused of damaging company property. He looked nervous, clutching his papers tightly, his voice trembling as he spoke. Normally, the local judge might have dismissed him quickly or made a sarcastic remark. But now, under Judge Thompson's silent observation, he asked gentle questions. He let the young man explain his side without interruption. For the first time in a long while, there was empathy in his tone. At one point, Judge Thompson leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "You see how different the atmosphere feels when we let people speak?" The presiding judge nodded quietly, not trusting himself to speak. As the hearing ended, Thompson stood and addressed the courtroom. "Justice," he said softly, "isn't only about punishment. It's about listening. Most people who come here aren't criminals. They're people in trouble, trying to be heard. When we treat them like they don't matter, we fail the very idea of justice." The words hung in the air, gentle but powerful. The audience listened, motionless. Even the court staff seemed to breathe differently afterward. Later that afternoon, after the cases were done, Thompson requested a private meeting with the presiding judge in his office. The air between them was thick with tension, though Thompson's expression remained calm. He began slowly. "I want to speak honestly. Yesterday was uncomfortable for both of us, but I believe every difficult moment can teach us something valuable. The presiding judge looked down, embarrassed. I was wrong, he said quietly. I judged you by how you looked, not who you were. I spoke to you in a way no one should speak to another person. Thompson nodded. I appreciate your honesty. But let me ask you something. Do you treat everyone who walks into this courtroom with the same tone? The question hit like a mirror being held up. The other judge hesitated, unable to answer. Thompson continued. This robe we wear doesn't make us better than others. It gives us responsibility, to be fair, patient, and kind even when people make mistakes. That's what separates a leader from someone who just holds power. There was a long pause. The only sound came from the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I understand, the presiding judge said finally. I suppose I forgot that somewhere along the way. Thompson smiled gently. Forgetting isn't the problem. Staying blind to it is. He stood up, ready to leave, but turned back at the door. Tomorrow, I'll be holding an open review session. I'd like you and your staff to attend. No punishments, just an honest talk about respect and courtroom conduct. The local judge nodded slowly, still processing the weight of those words. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and the lights dimmed, he stayed in his office, staring at the wooden gavel on his desk. For years, that gavel had symbolized power. But now, looking at it, he realized it was supposed to symbolize something else. Responsibility. He remembered the look on Thompson's face when he was told to leave, how calm he had remained, and how easily he could have humiliated him in return, but didn't. That kind of self-control came from real strength, not arrogance. The next morning, the courtroom was full again, not with hearings, but with people from all departments. Clerks, bailiffs, secretaries, even local lawyers, all gathered for the review session Thompson had mentioned. He stood at the front, speaking to them not like a superior, but like a teacher who genuinely cared. When people walk into this courthouse, he said, they're already scared. Many have never stood before a judge before. Some are guilty, some are innocent, but all of them deserve to be treated like human beings. He paused and looked around the room. A courtroom should not be a place of fear. It should be a place of truth. And truth doesn't grow where there's humiliation. People nodded silently, their faces thoughtful. Thompson continued, respect isn't given because of skin color, background, or wealth. It's earned through behavior. And the first rule of fairness is this: you can't demand respect if you don't give it first. The presiding judge listened quietly from the side of the room, every word sinking deeper. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel defensive. He felt humbled and oddly relieved. As the session ended, Thompson turned to him and said kindly, "You've built a career here. You have influence. You can still use it to make a difference." The local judge nodded slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "I will. I promise." When the meeting ended, people lingered for a while, talking softly about what they'd heard. Some said it was the first time they'd ever seen a judge speak like that, with heart instead of authority. Outside, the morning sun poured through the windows, warm and bright. Thompson walked down the courthouse steps, his briefcase swinging lightly by his side. He wasn't smiling out of pride, but from quiet satisfaction. He hadn't come to humiliate anyone. He'd come to remind them all of something simple, that justice without compassion isn't justice at all. Behind him, the presiding judge watched from the window, thinking deeply. It wasn't shame he felt anymore, it was awakening. That day, something in that small courthouse began to change. Slowly, quietly, but surely. And for the first time in many years, the halls of that old building began to feel a little lighter. The following week began with a sense of quiet change in the courthouse. Something had shifted after Judge Thompson's visit. People walked with a little more awareness. The laughter in the hallways was softer, the greetings a bit more genuine. Even the tone of conversations carried more respect than before. The presiding judge, once known for his sharp temper and cutting remarks, now entered the courtroom each day with calmness. The arrogance that had once filled his voice was gone. In its place was something new, humility. He greeted the clerks with a nod, thanked the officers when they handed him files, and listened to defendants without rushing them. But inside, he was still struggling. Every night he replayed that humiliating moment in his mind, the one where he had spoken down to a man who turned out to be his superior. He couldn't forget the look on Judge Thompson's face, calm and controlled, without a trace of anger. It wasn't the embarrassment that haunted him. It was the quiet strength behind that calmness. He wanted to understand it. How could a man be insulted so openly and still remain so composed? How could someone forgive so easily without showing pride or bitterness? One morning, after finishing the first set of hearings, he walked to his office and sat down heavily. The courthouse was quieter than usual. Through the small window behind him, he could see the old oak tree outside swaying gently in the wind. He closed his eyes for a moment, lost in thought when there was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and to his surprise, it was Judge Thompson. "Good morning," Thompson said with a small, polite smile. The local judge stood up quickly. "Good morning, sir. Please come in." Thompson sat down opposite him, setting his briefcase gently on the table. "I was passing through town again and thought I'd stop by," he said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," the other judge said quickly. "I'm glad you came." There was a brief silence. Both men sat quietly for a few seconds before Thompson spoke again. "I wanted to see how things are going here since our last conversation," he said. The presiding judge nodded. "I've been trying," he said honestly. "Trying to change how I handle things, how I speak to people. It's not easy after so many years of doing it the old way, but I'm learning." Thompson smiled. "That's all that matters. Change doesn't happen in a day. It happens through small steps that come from understanding." He looked around the room, his eyes soft but thoughtful. "You've served this courthouse for a long time. You've seen hundreds of people stand before you. Have you ever noticed how they look at you?" The question caught him off guard. "How they look at me?" he repeated. "Yes," Thompson said. "When they stand there, nervous, unsure, scared." "What do you think they see?" The judge thought for a moment. "I suppose they see authority," he said. "Someone who decides what happens next." Thompson nodded. "That's part of it. But they also see something deeper. To them, you're not just a judge, you're the face of justice itself. The way you treat them becomes, in their mind, the way justice treats them." Those words sank in slowly, settling deep inside him. Thompson continued, "When I travel to different courts, I see the same pattern everywhere. People talk about fairness, but they forget that fairness begins with tone, with how you speak to someone who has no power. If you can treat the weakest person with respect, then you've already done half the work of justice." The judge lowered his gaze, feeling the truth in every word. After a moment, Thompson leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to lecture you," he said kindly. "I came because I believe this courthouse can become an example for others. But that starts with leadership. You set the tone here. People follow your energy. If you're harsh, they'll be harsh. If you're fair, they'll learn fairness too." The presiding judge nodded slowly, feeling both humbled and encouraged. "You're right," he said. "I've let my title make me forget why I started this job in the first place. When I was young, I wanted to help people, not intimidate them. Somewhere along the way, I lost that." Thompson smiled warmly. "Then it's time to find it again." Just then, there was another knock at the door. The clerk stepped in, holding a file nervously. "Sir," he said, "we have a small issue in courtroom 2. A defendant's family member is arguing with a bailiff." The local judge stood immediately. "Let's go." Thompson followed him down the hall. As they entered the courtroom, they saw a young woman standing near the defense table, tears in her eyes. The bailiff stood between her and the judge's bench, trying to calm her down. "My brother didn't do anything wrong," she cried. "You people never listen. You don't care what happens to us." Her voice echoed through the room. Some of the people seated behind her murmured uncomfortably. The presiding judge raised his hand gently. "Ma'am," he said softly, "please take a seat. I'll listen to you." She hesitated, breathing hard, clearly expecting to be yelled at or thrown out, but his tone stayed calm. "I promise," he said. "You'll get your turn to speak. I'll hear you out." She slowly sat down, still emotional but quieter now. The courtroom relaxed. Even the bailiff looked surprised. The judge looked through the file, then turned to her again. "I understand this is hard for you," he said. "But let's go through this step by step. I want to make sure we do this right." He asked questions patiently, gave her space to explain, and treated her with the same respect he would show a lawyer. At the end of the hearing, the tension in the room had faded. The young woman wiped her tears and whispered, "Thank you," before leaving. Thompson, who had watched silently the entire time, smiled faintly as the courtroom cleared. "That," he said softly, "is what justice should look like." The presiding judge let out a small breath. It felt different, he admitted. Peaceful, even. "It feels different," Thompson said, "because when you lead with respect, the whole room follows." The two men walked back to the office together. The air between them no longer carried the weight of the past. It felt lighter, like a bridge had been built between them. Later that evening, when the day's hearings were over, the courthouse staff gathered in the hallway talking quietly about what had happened. The young woman's outburst, the judge's calm response, it had all left a strong impression. One of the older clerks said softly, "You can feel it, can't you? The whole atmosphere is changing. He's not the same judge anymore." Another nodded. "It's because of that new man, the visiting judge. He made everyone see things differently." They didn't know Thompson was standing nearby, listening with a quiet smile. He didn't step in or correct them. He simply turned and walked out of the building, knowing his job there was nearly done. As he reached the steps outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the courtyard, painting the walls in gold. He stopped for a moment, watching a group of schoolchildren pass by the courthouse gates, laughing as they played. It made him smile. Behind him, the courthouse door opened again. The presiding judge walked out, catching up to him. "Leaving already?" he asked. "Yes," Thompson said. "I've seen what I needed to see." The local judge nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for the visit, but for reminding me what this job truly means." Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just keep doing the right thing," he said. "People notice, even when it feels small. It matters." They shook hands, and for a moment, it wasn't one man judging another. It was two men understanding each other. As Thompson walked away down the courthouse steps, the wind lifted slightly, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree nearby. The local judge stood watching until he disappeared from view. For the first time in years, he felt proud, not of his position, but of the change he had begun to make. That night, he sat at his desk at home, writing a note he planned to share with his staff the next morning. It said, "Every person deserves respect even when they are wrong. Because respect isn't about who they are, it's about who we are." When he placed his pen down, he smiled to himself. The lesson had been hard, but it had opened his eyes in ways he never expected. And though Judge Thompson had left the courthouse, his presence remained, like a quiet echo reminding everyone that real justice begins not with the law, but with kindness. The room was completely still after the shocking moment when everyone realized who the quiet man truly was. The judge, who had spent the morning making arrogant remarks, looked pale. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his robe, pretending to stay composed. But the truth was clear. His pride had shattered in front of everyone. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, as if no one wanted to even breathe too loudly. The man who had been insulted so calmly stood up from his seat. His movements were slow but full of quiet confidence. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he look angry. His calmness alone made everyone uncomfortable because it carried a power far greater than shouting ever could. The senior judge, who had been mocked moments earlier, took a deep breath and looked at the people sitting before him, lawyers, clerks, and citizens. Then his eyes fell on the man who had humiliated him. "Your courtroom," he began, his voice calm but firm, "is a place where justice should live. But what I just witnessed is not justice. It's pride, and pride blinds people." Every word seemed to echo through the wooden walls. The local judge lowered his head, unable to look him in the eye. The man continued, "You looked at me and saw something less, not because of who I am, but because of what I look like. And that's not justice, that's judgment without truth." The clerk at the front desk swallowed nervously, glancing at the people in the back row who looked stunned. A young lawyer who had been smiling earlier when the humiliation took place now looked down at his shoes, clearly embarrassed. The senior judge didn't point fingers, but everyone in that room felt the weight of his words. He continued, "A courtroom is not your personal stage. Every person who steps in here, whether they are rich, poor, old, or young, deserves to be treated with dignity. Your robe does not give you power to look down on others. It gives you the responsibility to lift justice up." The local judge's lips trembled as he tried to respond. "Sir, But the senior judge gently raised his hand. "Let me finish," he said softly. "I didn't come here today to embarrass anyone. I came unannounced because I wanted to see how people are treated in courts like these. Unfortunately, what I saw was not respect, it was ego. A long silence followed. You could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Some people in the gallery shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. A woman in the front row nodded slightly, as if she agreed with every word. Finally, the senior judge turned back toward the people. We cannot build justice on prejudice. When you treat someone unfairly because of how they look, you destroy the very thing you swore to protect. The local judge's face was red now. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a weak, "I didn't mean to." The senior judge looked at him with a steady gaze. That's the problem. You didn't mean to, but you did, and if no one ever corrects it, you'll keep doing it. The tension in the room softened slightly as the senior judge's tone changed. Everyone makes mistakes, he said. Even judges. What matters is how we respond once we realize it. He stepped closer to the bench and looked the local judge in the eye. You have two choices today. You can hide behind excuses or you can grow from this moment. You can become the kind of judge people respect, not out of fear but because of fairness. The local judge took a deep breath. His voice was quiet, almost broken. You're right, he said. I've been on this bench for years and maybe I stopped seeing people as people. I saw cases, not faces. Maybe I needed this lesson. The senior judge nodded slowly, his expression softening. Then take it. Learn from it. Because true justice doesn't start with laws. It starts with the heart. The courtroom was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't tense anymore. It was thoughtful. People weren't afraid, they were moved. Some nodded, others looked away, reflecting on their own behavior. Even the bailiff, who had been smirking earlier, stood up straighter as if realizing his role in allowing that arrogance to grow. The senior judge turned back to the crowd. You all saw what happened today. Don't forget it. Respect is not something you give only to those who look like you or agree with you. It's something every human being deserves. When we forget that, we lose our humanity. He then gathered his papers, calm as ever, and walked toward the exit. But before leaving, he turned one last time to the local judge. You have authority, but use it wisely. Power without empathy is dangerous. The local judge nodded silently. You could tell his pride was gone, replaced by guilt, but also a spark of realization. After the senior judge left, no one spoke for a few moments. The courtroom stayed still, almost frozen in the weight of what had just happened. Then one by one, people began whispering quietly. The clerk looked at the local judge, who still hadn't moved. His robe suddenly didn't seem like a symbol of pride anymore. It looked heavy, like a reminder of how much responsibility it carried. Later that day, when the courtroom cleared out, the local judge sat alone on the bench. The afternoon sun filtered through the window, lighting up the wooden panels of the room. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the empty seats where people had sat earlier. For the first time in years, he felt small, but not in a humiliating way. It was a humbling kind of small, the kind that makes you see the world clearly. He thought about every person he might have dismissed too quickly, every time he assumed the worst about someone before hearing their story. He realized how often he used his position to speak, not to listen. And now he understood how dangerous that was. In his mind, he replayed the senior judge's words. Power without empathy is dangerous. That line echoed again and again. He rubbed his forehead, sighed, and whispered softly to himself. He's right. The next morning, the local judge came in early. The courthouse was quiet, the halls empty. He walked slowly to his bench, placed his robe on the chair, and stood there for a long time before sitting down. When the first case began, his tone was different. He looked each person in the eye, spoke with patience, and listened without interrupting. People noticed the change almost immediately. The clerks exchanged glances. Even the lawyers seemed surprised. The once cold and harsh judge now spoke with calm respect. He wasn't pretending. He was genuinely trying. At lunch, one of the clerks approached him nervously and said, "Sir, you seem different today." He smiled faintly. "I think I'm finally doing my job right," he said. Over the next few days, small changes began to appear around the courthouse. The staff treated visitors more politely. The security officers stopped making careless jokes about people waiting in line. And slowly, the reputation of the courthouse began to shift. The senior judge's visit had started as a humiliation, but it turned into a turning point. The local judge didn't forget that moment, he carried it with him. He started mentoring younger judges, teaching them that fairness wasn't just about laws, but about how you look at another human being. One afternoon, a new intern joined the courthouse and asked the local judge why he took so much time listening to each person. He smiled and said quietly, "Because sometimes the truth hides behind silence, and if we don't listen carefully, we might miss it." The intern nodded, not fully understanding yet, but he would in time. That day, as the court adjourned, the local judge stood by the window, watching people leave the building. The same courthouse that once carried an air of pride now felt lighter, warmer. He thought of the senior judge again and whispered, "Thank you." It was strange, he thought, how life could change in a single moment. One act of calm dignity had shattered years of arrogance and opened his eyes. And though the senior judge was long gone, his words stayed, like a quiet reminder in the back of his mind every time he put on his robe. Justice begins with how we treat each other. He smiled softly, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: peace. And that day, for the first time, the courtroom truly felt like a place where justice lived. Weeks passed after that unforgettable day in the courtroom. The story of what happened spread quietly at first, then faster than anyone expected. People from nearby towns started talking about it, how a proud judge was humbled, and how another man, calm and wise, turned a moment of insult into a powerful lesson. Some said it was justice finding its voice. Others said it was karma. But for those who were there, it felt like witnessing truth itself walk into the room. The senior judge, who had handled everything with such grace, returned to his duties in the city. He didn't boast about what happened or share it with the media. He wasn't that kind of man. He simply believed that true lessons didn't need noise. They echoed on their own through the people who were changed by them. Meanwhile, in the small courthouse where everything happened, things were not the same anymore. The local judge, once known for his sharp tongue and impatient tone, had become quieter. His voice, though still firm, carried something new: kindness. The clerks noticed how he greeted them every morning now. The lawyers noticed he listened more carefully. Even defendants, who used to tremble before him, saw a different kind of man behind the bench. He had changed, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to. That humiliation had broken down a wall inside him, a wall built from pride and ignorance. And once it fell, he began to see people differently. One day, a young man came into the courtroom wearing worn-out clothes and looking nervous. His case was small, something about a parking fine, but his voice shook when he spoke. The local judge listened quietly, then spoke gently. "Take your time, son. Tell me what happened." The man looked surprised. No judge had ever spoken to him that kindly before. After explaining, the judge reduced his fine and advised him to keep his papers in order next time. The man smiled in relief and said, "Thank you, sir. You treated me like a person, not just a case." That one line stayed with the judge for days. It reminded him that he was finally becoming the kind of man he should have been all along. Later that month, a formal letter arrived from the city courthouse. It was from the senior judge. It wasn't long or formal. It was short, handwritten, and direct. It said, "Justice begins with understanding. I'm glad you found that truth for yourself. Keep walking that path." The local judge held the letter for a long time, reading it over and over. It wasn't forgiveness he was looking for. It was acknowledgement, and that letter gave him that peace. After that, he started something new. He invited young clerks, law students, and junior lawyers to informal sessions every Friday evening after court. They called it the open bench. In these meetings, they didn't just discuss laws. They talked about people, the emotions behind every case, the lives affected by every decision. He told them stories, sometimes from his own mistakes, other times from lessons he learned the hard way. During one of those sessions, a student asked him, "Sir, what changed you? You've been a judge for years, but everyone says you're different now." He smiled, looked at the group, and said quietly, "One day I judged a man before I knew who he was. I looked at his skin, not his soul. I thought I was the most powerful man in the room, but I was wrong. He showed me what real strength looks like, dignity in the face of disrespect. That day I realized power means nothing if it isn't used with kindness." The room stayed silent. You could hear the distant hum of ceiling fans and the soft creak of wooden benches. Everyone knew the story he was talking about, but hearing it in his own words made it real. As months passed, That courthouse earned a new reputation. People who once dreaded walking through its doors began to say, "It's fair now. You'll be heard there." The same walls that once carried echoes of arrogance now carried calm voices, respectful tones, and sometimes even laughter. But the story didn't end there. One morning, the senior judge returned to town, unannounced once again. When he entered the courtroom, he saw something that made him smile quietly. The local judge was in session, handling a family dispute. His tone was patient. His questions were kind but firm. He gave both sides time to speak and made sure they felt heard before giving his decision. When the hearing ended, people left the room looking relieved, not bitter. The senior judge waited until the room cleared. Then he walked up to the bench. The local judge stood up immediately, surprised but pleased to see him. "I didn't expect you today," he said softly. The senior judge smiled. "I wanted to see how things were going. And I must say I'm proud of what I see." The local judge looked down for a moment, his voice humble. "I still think about that day. I wish it hadn't happened the way it did." The senior judge shook his head gently. "If it hadn't, you wouldn't be who you are now. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from our biggest mistakes." They stood there quietly for a moment. There was no tension between them now, only mutual respect. After a brief pause, the senior judge added, "Do you know what the best part of this story is?" The local judge looked curious. "What's that?" "You didn't just change yourself, you changed this whole place. That's what true redemption looks like." The local judge smiled faintly. "I just tried to be better." "That's all any of us can do," the senior judge said kindly. "Keep trying." They shared a simple handshake, not as superiors or subordinates, but as two men who understood each other deeply. When the senior judge left, he didn't make any announcement or speech. He just walked out quietly, knowing that his job there was done. Over the next year, the courthouse continued to grow in reputation. People trusted it again. The staff worked like a team. New posters were placed on the walls, reminding everyone who walked in, "Respect is the first rule of justice." The story of that day slowly became part of local legend. Some told it as a story of justice, others as a story of change. But for those who were there, it was a reminder that no matter how powerful you think you are, there's always something bigger: human dignity. One evening, long after court hours, the local judge sat alone in the empty courtroom. The sun was setting, painting the walls golden. He looked at the bench, the same one he had once sat behind with so much pride and ego. He smiled, thinking about how far he had come. He whispered quietly to himself, "I used to think the robe gave me power, but now I know it only gives me duty." At that moment, a janitor walked in to clean. The judge stood up, helped him pick up some scattered papers, and said, "Thank you for what you do. This place runs because of people like you." The janitor looked surprised, smiled, and said, "Thank you, sir. No one's ever said that to me before." The judge chuckled softly. Well, they should. That small act said everything about the man he had become. A few months later, he was invited to speak at a regional law seminar. His topic was the heart of justice. Standing at the podium, he looked at the crowd of judges, lawyers, and students before him. He took a breath and began, "Justice isn't a law written on paper. It's a promise, one we make to every person who stands before us. It's not about authority. It's about humanity." The audience listened closely. His words weren't grand or poetic, they were simple, honest, and real. When he finished, the room broke into quiet applause. As he stepped down from the stage, a young woman approached him and said, "Sir, I want to be a judge one day. Thank you for reminding me what it really means." He smiled warmly and said, "Then remember this. Every robe hides a human being. Never forget to be one." Years later, when people looked back on his time in that courthouse, they didn't remember him for his harsh decisions or his pride. They remembered him as the man who learned humility and passed it on to others. The story of those two judges, one proud and one patient, became a reminder that no matter how high someone rises, true greatness comes from kindness, and somewhere in a quiet office miles away, the senior judge would sometimes think of that small courthouse and smile, knowing that a single moment of calm dignity had changed not just one man, but an entire system. Because in the end, justice isn't just what happens in court. It's how we treat each other when no one's watching.